What do you remember about JFK being elected?
Yeah, John F. K. was a good president.
Everybody said we shouldn't vote for Kennedy because he was Catholic and then the Pope would run the country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of course that didn't happen. So Richard and I were the only ones in our family who voted for Kennedy.
Everybody liked him because he was different. He was young. He gave hope to the country.
He was a real statesman, like he was like for the people, and he did a lot of good things for the country.
It was just absolutely wonderful. He was such a wonderful, wonderful president, and so young and so handsome, and and his wife was so beautiful, and they had these beautiful little children. And
I liked him, and I liked his ideas.
Could you just tell us more about the Freedom Riders and the James Meredith confrontation? Like, what was happening, what was going on?
well, I just know that a lot of young men and women from the North went down south on what they called freedom rides, to support civil rights, to support the black families who were living without civil rights.
We had issues with Cuba. It was called the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
And he got involved with that, but I guess that got defused because he was smart enough not to really push it so that we went to war.
President Kennedy was involved in the Bay of Pigs. There was that standoff, and all the rockets were aimed at the U.S.
Do you remember when the Berlin Wall was constructed?
Yes. The war was over in 1945. And not much longer the wall was constructed, and Berlin was divided into several sections.
Yeah.
That was very difficult for the German people, so then it became East Berlin and West Berlin. One time I went with my brother into East Berlin, and it was quite a bit different than West Berlin. East Berlin, it was very dangerous to cross the wall. If they did, someone got killed doing it.
Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The Cuban Missile Crisis was real scary, for like a long weekend. And then it was, over.
It was very, very close to having an atomic war. That was not too far. That was very dangerous.
Do you remember Martin Luther King's march?
I remember Martin Luther King and, the speech he gave in the Capitol.
This one woman was at the Martin Luther King rally in Washington, and she was always very proud of that. Again, that was all over the television.
I remember his slogan was, "I had a dream."
And of course, his famous civil rights speech in Washington, D.C.
When I was very young, we took a road trip to Florida, and I remember clearly that when you made a road stop for gasoline or something, there was bathrooms for whites, they actually said that, and bathrooms for blacks. So as a little kid, of course, I had to go in a white bathroom. And any black people had to go in their bathroom. He didn't think anything about it. It was like, that's the way it was.
For the black people to be treated like they were treated, it always upset me. And I remember during the Second World War, black people were required to fight in the war, I remember. And when they came back home, they were treated not very well, and it bothered me. Here they were willing to give their lives for their country, and then they come home and they had to sit in back of the bus and couldn't sleep in certain hotels and stuff like that. It bothered me that they were treated like that.
He was trying to push for equal rights and not to segregate bathrooms and places to eat, and And when you took public transportation, that everybody could sit on the same seats and not segregate blacks from whites. And that they should step into the sidewalk and let the white person walk by.
That was a very nice speech, and I think he had the right idea to do things without fighting.
Do you remember when JFK was assassinated?
Yes.
Yes.
It was terrible.
Do you remember watching it on TV?
Yeah.
We're actually glued to the TV.
Yeah. Well, you were working. I was actually watching TV.
But that night, that's all they covered.
His assassination was just absolutely overwhelming for us. I was a senior in college when it happened. It was in the fall of 1963.
I was in high school in a classroom, and they announced it over the PA system that the president had been shot.
Or do you remember where JFK was?
Yeah, he was in the car
In Texas,
in Texas.
campaigning.
Yeah, and his wife was sitting next to him.
She had a pink outfit on
Yeah, it was all got all.
that quickly turned red. Gruesome, ain't it?
We all remember exactly where we were and what we were doing when we found out he had been assassinated. And I was in a play called Blood Wedding, and the director decided that we had another show that night, and he decided we were going to do it. And we were all in the dressing room with tears running down our faces, you know, and finally the president called and said, no, the show was canceled, you know.
He just slumped over her lap. It was really terrible. They were in an open air car.
Hmm.
They don't do that anymore.
It was reality in your face, and we just were stunned.
All before this happened, because they showed them arriving at the airport in Texas and getting into this open car. They presented Mrs. Kennedy with red roses, and they were all happy, waving. All of a sudden, the shot. So this whole thing was televised, not because they thought it was going to happen,
No,
but because
because
it was
news.
an event. You know, it was something.
He was campaigning.
Yeah, because he was about to
Run for the
run
second
again
term.
for the second term,
It was
right?
like the first campaign stop a year ahead of.
Yeah, we were shocked. We didn't move from the TV
I mean, everybody
for days.
was crying and ailing and wailing.
Do you remember anything about Johnson becoming president and like the Great Society? Like how he was? Did you like him?
I didn't like him as a president too much. He's kind of like out of my memory. I mean, I know he was a president, but I don't remember anything worthwhile that he did or didn't do.
President Johnson, God bless him, you know, signed the Civil Rights Bill, and that was a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Do you remember when Lyndon B. Johnson took over after her shot?
He actually took over on a plane.
Yeah, he was sworn in.
On a plane from Texas back to Washington.
President Johnson was certainly a totally different kind of man or president than Kennedy was.
When Lyndon B. Johnson took over, do you think he did a good job with the Great Society?
Not really.
Not really. That's a personal opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you?
No, we don't. We were never very impressed, one way or the other, really.
Do you remember anything about President Johnson's the Great Society?
That's every group of every president usually has some sort of a thing, you know.
Yeah.
And Johnson's was the Great Society, and that's all I know about it. It's just, you know, oh, well, this must be the Great Society.
Do you remember anything about Vietnam?
Yeah, Vietnam, I remember it was a draft. So what the government said is that they're going to have a lottery, and it's based on your birthday. So they would, like a day, a week later, whatever it was, I forget, but they put all the birth dates in like a newspaper, and like 365 days in a year. So they just put like a number to each person. So like the next day we went to high school and was sitting in class, and we all knew what our number was, and asking friends and stuff like, what's your number? And I remember my number being 241.
If you were in college, you were deferred. You got a deferment. 1A is when you you're going to be drafted real fast.
I have bad memories of the Vietnam War. It was a terrible war. And what made it exceptionally terrible was you really didn't know, the Americans really didn't know who the enemy was. What I mean by that is women and children were armed and would actually kill our troops with surprise killings. So that kind of made us crazy, where if we attacked a village, we had no choice but to clean out the village.
When the men came back from Vietnam, they were ostracized. It was almost like they had asked to, to do this instead of been drafted. And when they came back, they weren't cheered as veterans, as thank you for your service kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And years later, that made me feel very sad and sorry.
It made them disturbed that a lot of them came home and didn't have nice lives after that, because haunting them was the fact that they had to do what they had to do.
In Vietnam, it wasn't like fighting in the Second World War where people, are fighting each other. It was in a jungle, and so many of the Vietnamese were in the tunnels, and it was almost like they couldn't find them. It wasn't it wasn't the kind of war that we'd ever fought before.
We were like kind of nervous. If you drove in the car with them, they had like the shakes, and they were like really extremely nervous, just from being over there. Like, I guess being and it impacted them mentally and physically to some degree.
They were all listed in the newscast for those men who had died in the Vietnam War each day.
Martin Luther King's assassination was just absolutely horrible. But we had lived through Kennedy, and that whole decade of, wonderful people being killed. It was awful.
He was a good person to try to say that everyone is just created equal.
He was quite a great man, and it was so sad that he got assassinated.
I know there was a lot of news coverage and stuff, but that Martin Luther King had been shot.
Was there a lot of stuff on TV?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember hearing about the My Lai massacre or the
Absolutely.
Pentagon Papers?
Yeah. The My Lai massacre was, what was his name? Lieutenant Calley? Something like that.
Okay.
Horrible. It was horrible. They mowed down everyone in this village. It was just awful. The psychological effects for the people who were fighting must have been just terrible. You go in and there's this woman with this baby carriage and she wheels it up to you and then it explodes, And those kinds of things were happening. So you lose a sense of reality. You lose a sense of humanness, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's why My Lai happened.
Do you remember the landing on the moon?
Yes.
What do you remember about it?
I believe the moon landing was in July or August of 1969. I remember, so I was 4 and a half. I remember my parents brought my brother and I out into the living room. We sat on the floor watching the black and white TV. It was a small little TV against the wall, and we sat there and watched the news broadcast.
First we put like chimpanzees and capsules and sent them to the moon too, and then we finally got people to actually go.
Do you remember Woodstock?
Yeah, I also remember Woodstock. Remember also them saying that they'd shut down the thruway because so many people had come to it, and they weren't expecting all of those people to come.
Right.
So it was quite the event. If beyond just the concert, it was quite the mass humanity. Right nearby where we lived. In New Paltz.
We were just not. We weren't hippie people.
It was back in '69. Everybody was asking me in school and stuff, "You gonna go to Woodstock?" And I'm like, let's go up there, and people all muddy and it's dirty, it's raining, there's no place to go to the bathroom, you're in a big field. I said, it's really not my cup of tea.